This lecture for Tuesday, February 1st, will provide you with an introduction to the art of the 17th century, which is known as Baroque. And I anticipate that in this PowerPoint we will get through the equivalent of 1 2-hour class period for Tuesday, February 1st, which will cover the Italian Baroque. Now, the Baroque, as we've been talking about, is really the capstone of the events that have been transpiring with the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So with the Counter-Reformation, and we'll be in Italy today, art, as we've been talking about quite regularly, became a tool to attract people back to the church and to celebrate the authority and the glory of Catholicism. So we'll be looking at Rome again today as this artistic center of the Counter-Reformation. On Thursday, we'll be studying the rise of the Dutch Republic, watching it become one of the richest European states and among the most tolerant of different religious and philosophical views, and we've gotten hints of that so far in the Northern Renaissance. Toward the end of Thursday's lecture, we'll travel to France, really for the first time, and look at Louis XIV, the Sun King, the divine monarch, and think about how this autocracy led to this really grandiose, classicizing Baroque decoration and artistic expression. Additionally, we want to remember that this period of the 17th century was one of scientific inquiry and advancement. So we've got big names like Galileo, Copernicus, Francis Bacon, Descartes, and all of these people, scientists, explorers, thinkers, are really interested in material observation, objectivity, and logical reasoning. They're really laying down the foundations for what in the 18th century Enlightenment would explode into what we consider modern science today. So a lot of the foundational principles of our own contemporary society were really being struck during this period. It was also an era of great colonization, discovery, and expansion, discovering the world. And it's something I think that we take for granted because we have so much technology and we know so much about the world, but through their eyes, it was a completely new enterprise. So everything's really opening up, and I think it's a very kind of optimistic era to be living in, and one that the future holds so much, and there's still so much unknown. The word Baroque itself, that you've probably heard before and that we'll be talking about a lot over the next two sessions, comes from the word Barroco. And this is on your list of terms. And Barroco comes from a Portuguese word that means an imperfect, irregular pearl. And as we'll see through the different variations of the Baroque in these different geographical centers, this idea of imperfection and irregularity and even organic form will be reflected in a very new, expressive, painterly style that we're going to be studying. Now, the Baroque itself has many different connotations. One is emotionalism. So after the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church embarked on a program of the Counter-Reformation, which we've talked about quite a bit and you've read about quite a bit in Stockstead. And art was intended to be emotionally appealing to influence large audiences. So think about, how do artists that we're looking at achieve a sense of emotionalism? And we'll talk about these formal choices that they make as we get into the material. Another aspect of the Baroque is naturalism. We'll see an increasing use of elements from everyday life in seemingly unposed, informal arrangements. That strict classical geometry of the Renaissance that was meant to be more intellectual in tone and effect breaks apart and becomes more free form and organic. And we'll see this both in the context for religious subjects and the everyday as the principal subject in itself. So a wide variety of genres. Classicism is part of the Baroque. So you see we've got this pastiche, the religious, the classical, and we'll see with the French Baroque that they really adhered to Renaissance ideals, principles of composition based on Roman ideals. And tenebrism. This word will come up again and again, and tenebrism refers to, in a way, chiaroscuro, or strong light and shadow effects. And we'll be looking at Caravaggio and his extreme influence on stylistic, light, dark, this use of tenebrism during the 17th century. And he would influence many other artists, as we'll see today. So Baroque art often combined all of these elements in one work, and especially we'll see emotionalism, naturalism, and tenebrism. The French are kind of doing their own thing with that classical vocabulary. But we'll begin in Italy today, and we're back at St. Peter's Basilica and Piazza in the Vatican. And we've talked about Bramante's plan for the actual church here in the back, that central, perfectly symmetrical plan, then taken on by Michelangelo. And then finally, we talked about the lengthening of this nave to accommodate more worshipers. Today we'll briefly discuss the facade that was redone by Carlo Maderno, and then these fantastic arms, this colonnade on the piazza just in front of the church, done by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So in Rome, of course, we're talking about Catholicism like we've been doing almost the entire first half of the class. And it's the seat of the papacy. So 17th century, they're in the midst of recovering from the blow of the Protestant Reformation. And Rome again becomes an artistic center and uses its wealth and its power and its artists to really show the world that it still holds its supremacy in the Christian world. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who we'll talk about in great depth today, was a leading artist of Rome and of the Counter-Reformation. He was the son of a sculptor. He was known as extroverted, sociable, witty, confident, and a fast worker. He became indebted to patronage of artistically enlightened popes, so he had a really important job in this emerging Counter-Reformation culture. So here we can see Bernini's plan for creating a really sweeping and grand vista of an entrance to this iconic, by now really an iconic, important structure for the Catholic Church and its followers. In order to create a sense of grandiosity, to awe and inspire visitors, and to accommodate large amounts of people, which was part of the Counter-Reformation goal of drawing people back into the church, he did several things. First, he added this colonnaded structure here on both sides. So here we have the piazza in the middle, or a plaza, and then a colonnade that extends straight from the structure itself, and then these arced arms that come around. He included what amount to 284 columns in the Doric order, and I think I've got a close-up. Sometimes they're called the Tuscan order, which is kind of a simplified regional version of that solid, plain, sturdy Doric order. And each of these is 39 feet tall, so quite large, and you can see the figures here just below. So you get a sense of how tall this really is. Along this colonnade, just above, on the balustrade, there are 96 statues of saints, each 15 feet high. And you can see them kind of lined up like little armies of saints looking over the visitors to the piazza. So a really grandiose, monumental scheme for visitors who are literally engulfed. When you walk into this piazza, you're just surrounded by monumental architecture, and it's quite overwhelming. So this colonnade makes up a portico, and so this actual structure here is called a portico, and you can see it again here. And it's dramatic, it's large, it's sweeping, and I think your book called this, or described it as the motherly arms of the church. And what a perfect metaphor for the Counter-Reformation, to be sweeping in and embracing Catholic followers into this important structure for Catholicism. And there is a slight ascension to get to the front door of St. Peter's Basilica. So the experience of architecture as a really social space and an inspirational space happens before you even walk in the door. There's room for everybody, and you get swept along up onto the ascension into this important structure. We talked a little bit about how that extension of the nave as well as chapels replacing the side aisles, allowed for more people to congregate inside the church. And the facade was also redesigned. And you can see here we've got these colossal order of columns that extend from the first to the second floor. The facade is made up of projecting planes, so you've got one here, it steps out here at the pilaster, and then the main portico with this pediment sticks out the farthest. So there's a sense of movement, not only in the piazza and not only in Michelangelo's redesign with this kind of undulating, curving exterior, but in the facade as well. You've got a sense of successive planes of space that are projecting outward and greeting the visitor as he or she makes his way toward this imposing facade. So overall for St. Peter's Basilica and the piazza that Gian Lorenzo Bernini created, the goal was to accommodate huge crowds and enhance the visibility of the Pope as he was addressing the people. And in terms of the Baroque sensibility that we're seeing in architecture and public design, it's dramatic, it's grandiose in its proportions. There's a goal of facilitating movement visually and physically for the viewer. And the viewer, we become a participant in this monument or in this work of architecture. And we'll see similar effects in the way that the viewer participates in a work of art. So we talked a lot about how the Renaissance kind of played around with illusion and little compositional devices to break that barrier between our space and the two-dimensional pictorial space. And the Baroque art of the Baroque period will take that and do that tenfold. We're going to be seeing a lot of dynamism between the viewer and the work of art. And again, that was supposed to create a feeling and sweep you up into this Catholic Reformation desire for you to feel connected to God. And it's so significant that art and architecture becomes the tool to do that. Once you're inside St. Peter's Basilica and you walk down that long extended nave, you will see right beyond the crossing here toward the apse of the church, the baldacchino, which Gian Lorenzo Bernini constructed, built, sculpted between 1624 and 1633. And it's in gilt bronze, so very beautiful, rich, luxurious material. Pope Urban VIII commissioned the work in 1623, but as we'll see, he also put his own personal stamp on it with specific symbols that allude to his family. The baldacchino comes from the word baldachin, or a canopy, that was often used in church processions and then would be placed at the high altar of a large church. So what Bernini did was create a permanent baldacchino that was 100 feet tall, which is huge, and you can see the scale again with this figure here. You don't even get past these stone piers before you get to the bronze. So it's a really imposing figure and gives you a sense too of how large the interior of this church is. If this is 100 feet tall, imagine how high the very heights of the architectural structure are. So part of the emphasis of putting this enormous imposing baldacchino is a dramatic focus on the altar here and on the Mass. So you're sitting in the nave at church and this is what you're focusing on. It's kind of a reminder of our own simplicity and we're like a speck of sand in the entire universe. But the priest would be underneath this baldacchino doing the Mass, and you're watching from afar. It's very imposing. And you can see when light comes in, it creates almost this otherworldly, heavenly kind of atmosphere. The baldacchino we can think of as a combination of architecture and sculpture. So we've got this large imposing structure, but as we'll see, it's also intricately detailed. We have these vines, putti, little bumblebees, and all sorts of details. You see the Holy Spirit here underneath the canopy. The columns themselves we can think of as a reference to two different sources. One, the Old